Behind the frozen stone of a 14th-century convent, a nun whispers a prayer, but it is not to God. It is a secret code. While the world sees fasting and thorns, inside the Mother Superior's private chambers, the air is thick with forbidden musk and the rustle of smuggled silk. You have been told tales of holy silence, but you have never heard the truth about the clandestine pleasure clubs that turned the cross into a key for ecstasy and made the Inquisition tremble in absolute horror. Deep within the bowels of an abandoned Cistercian monastery, where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the silence of centuries, lies a forgotten crypt. Beneath the flickering light of a single lamp, the stone walls appear to weep, their surfaces slick with the moisture of a subterranean world. Here, hidden behind a rotting tapestry depicting the agony of the saints, a secret niche remains untouched by time or the prying eyes of the inquisitive. It is a place where the sacred and the profane have engaged in a silent dance for over 600 years, waiting for someone to disturb the heavy dust and reveal the secrets buried beneath the cold altar. A slight pressure on a specific stone, worn smooth by the touch of desperate hands, reveals a mechanism long thought lost to the decay of the Middle Ages. The wall groans as a hidden panel, intricately carved with the image of a sorrowful Madonna, slides back to expose a cavity never intended for the light of day. Within this hollow space, protected from the elements and the wrath of the Church, rests a small, exquisite chest. It is crafted from the finest ivory and wrapped in the softest white lambskin, an object of such obvious luxury that its presence in a place of ascetic devotion feels like a direct challenge to the very heavens themselves. The lock, though rusted by the passage of time, yields with a sharp, metallic snap that echoes through the vaulted chamber like a sudden intrusion. As the lid is slowly lifted, the expected sight of yellowed bones or jagged hair shirts is absent, replaced by something far more scandalous and unexpected. Instead of the grim reminders of mortality, the box contains a collection of items that speak of life, desire, and a defiant pursuit of joy. Silken ribbons of deep crimson and midnight blue spill over the edges, their texture still supple despite the hundreds of years spent in darkness, serving as a vibrant contrast to the gray and lifeless stone. Beneath the silks lie small, ornate glass vials, their stoppers sealed with wax to preserve the potent essences contained within. Even through the ancient glass, the faint, intoxicating aroma of musk, sandalwood, and rare Eastern resins begins to fill the stagnant air of the crypt. These are the scents of forbidden markets and distant lands, perfumes that were once used to mask the smell of incense during gatherings that had nothing to do with the divine. These artifacts suggest a world where the sensory experience was not a sin to be suppressed, but a sacred ritual to be celebrated in the deepest privacy of the night, far from the watchful eyes of the friars. At the very bottom of the ivory chest lies the most dangerous treasure of all, a thick roll of parchment, bound with a gold cord and sealed with a signet of an unknown order. The ink is dark and bold, written in a hand that suggests a woman of high education and even higher status. As the scroll unfurls, it reveals a series of intricate illuminations that blend traditional religious motifs with scenes of startling intimacy. Here, the boundaries between spiritual ecstasy and earthly pleasure are deliberately blurred, creating a visual language that spoke only to those initiated into the most secret of circles, where the flesh was honored as much as the soul. The text itself is a masterpiece of deception, written in a complex code where traditional Latin prayers serve as a skeletal structure for something entirely different. Each liturgical phrase is followed by a commentary in the vernacular, explaining how the words are to be used as signals for meetings, gestures of affection, and the orchestration of elaborate gatherings. To a casual observer or a suspicious monk, it would appear to be a book of hours or a guide to meditation. However, to the women who once possessed it, these pages were a map to a hidden kingdom of autonomy where they were no longer the mere subjects of a harsh and patriarchal god. This discovery shatters the conventional image of the 14th century as a time of uniform piety and joyless submission for the female inhabitants of the cloister. It points toward a widespread, organized movement of noblewomen and nuns who refused to let their spirits be crushed by the heavy stones of their surroundings. These clubs, functioning with a sophistication that would baffle the modern mind, allowed their members to bypass the rigid structures of society. They transformed their cells into meeting rooms and their gardens into sanctuaries of shared confidence, creating a culture of mutual support that was as radical as it was hidden from history. During this period, the Church held an absolute monopoly on the female body and soul, dictating every aspect of their existence from the cradle to the grave. For a noblewoman, marriage was a political transaction, and for a nun, the veil was often a forced seclusion intended to remove her from the inheritance cycles of her family. Yet, within these very institutions designed to control them, women found the means to reclaim their agency. The existence of the ivory chest proves that the walls of the monastery were not just barriers to the world, but shields behind which a clandestine rebellion could flourish and grow, fueled by a thirst for liberty. The names mentioned in the margins of the manuscript include some of the most powerful families in Christendom, suggesting that this was not the work of a few isolated rebels. Instead, it was a network that stretched across borders, connecting the grandest abbeys of France with the secluded convents of the Rhine Valley. These were women who shared secrets through messengers disguised as pilgrims and who used the cover of religious festivals to coordinate their activities. Their solidarity was their greatest weapon, and their silence was the foundation upon which they built their secret society of pleasure and intellectual freedom in an age of darkness. What makes these findings truly shocking is not merely the presence of physical desire, but the intellectual justification provided for it within the text. The manuscript argues that the human body is a temple not for suffering, but for the experience of beauty in all its forms. It challenges the very concept of original sin, suggesting instead that the pursuit of happiness is the highest form of worship. This was a philosophy that threatened to undo the entire social order of the Middle Ages, as it removed the need for priestly intercession and placed the power of salvation and joy directly into the hands of the individual woman, standing alone before her Creator. As the lamplight flickers and threatens to go out, the reality of what has been found begins to sink in. This ivory chest is more than a collection of forbidden items, it is a scream across time from women who would not be silenced. It raises haunting questions about how many other such larcens lie hidden in the ruins of Europe, and how much of our history has been carefully scrubbed of such stories. The existence of this parallel reality suggests that the Middle Ages were not just a time of faith, but a period of intense, hidden vibrance where the human heart fought its most desperate battles in the dark, seeking a light the Church could not provide. The stage is now set to explore the origins of this secret movement, to look beyond the ivory chest and into the lives of the women who risked everything for a moment of genuine connection. We must journey back to the year 1348, when the world seemed to be ending and the rules of the old order began to crumble under the weight of the Black Death. In that chaos, the seeds of these secret societies were sown, watered by the tears of the bereaved and the desires of those who realized that if life was to be short, it must also be lived with an intensity that the authorities of the earth could never authorize or control. The 14th century covered Europe in a shroud of plague and rigid piety, transforming the life of a noblewoman into a series of endless prohibitions. Girls from noble families, who did not find an advantageous marriage, were ruthlessly given to monasteries, turning sacred abbeys into places of exile for those who thirsted for life, not oblivion. In this stifling atmosphere of humility, a protest began to emerge that did not seek political power or open rebellion, but went deep underground, using the very structure of church life as the ideal camouflage for secret meetings. The arrival of the Great Mortality in the year 1347 exacerbated the existing social pressures, creating a world where death was the only constant companion. Families, terrified of losing their status and their lands, tightened their control over the female members of their households. Every marriage became a desperate gamble for survival, and every girl was a pawn in a game she was never allowed to play. The pressure to remain chaste was not merely a religious ideal but a practical necessity for the preservation of the family name in a time when the very foundations of society were crumbling. As the bells of the cathedrals tolled incessantly for the dead, a sense of profound spiritual disillusionment began to take root in the hearts of those confined behind the abbey walls. They saw that the most pious monks and the most innocent novices were taken by the fever just as readily as the most hardened sinners. This observation led to a silent questioning of the Church's narrative of divine justice and the necessity of extreme asceticism. If God was indifferent to the suffering of his most devoted servants, then perhaps the laws of the world were not as immutable as the bishops claimed to the public. The physical environment of the 14th century monastery was designed to crush the individual spirit through its sheer coldness and lack of comfort. The stone floors chilled the feet of the sisters as they stood for hours in the choir, and the meager diet of bread and water left them perpetually weakened. This deprivation was intended to elevate the soul, but for many, it only served to sharpen their focus on what they were missing. In the flickering shadows of the scriptorium, eyes would meet across the desks, sharing a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with human connection. The rebellion began with the smallest of deviations from the daily routine, acts of defiance so subtle that they were nearly invisible to the overseers. A group of sisters might linger a moment too long in the gardens after the evening prayer, or a noblewoman visiting for a retreat might whisper a secret into the ear of a favorite nun. These moments were the seeds of the secret societies, the first instances where the established order was bypassed in favor of a private, shared reality. They realized that the monastery offered a unique form of privacy that could be exploited by those who knew the rhythms. By the year 1352, these isolated acts of resistance had begun to coalesce into organized clubs with their own rules and their own sense of purpose. They adopted the terminology of the church to protect themselves, referring to their secret gatherings as extra hours of prayer or special devotionals for the souls of the departed. This linguistic camouflage was highly effective, as it allowed them to move through the abbey and meet in groups without arousing the suspicion of the more traditional authorities. The language of the cross became a cipher where every word carried a meaning. The connection between the secular elite and the monastic world was a vital artery for the growth of these clandestine organizations. Noblewomen, weary of the domestic prisons of their castles, found that the convent provided a rare space where they could gather with their peers without the presence of their husbands. They brought with them the latest philosophical ideas from the universities and the luxurious fabrics that were otherwise forbidden within the holy walls. This exchange of goods and ideas created a bridge between two worlds, uniting women of different backgrounds in a common pursuit of liberty. Within the secret chambers of these societies, the atmosphere was one of calculated elegance and profound sensory relief. The members would discard their heavy woolen habits in favor of silk robes that were smuggled into the abbey in crates marked for the library. They used rare oils to soothe their skin and burned incense that smelled of roses rather than the acrid smoke of the common tallow candles. These gatherings were a total sensory rejection of the ascetic life, a way of reclaiming the beauty of the physical world that the church had labeled as a temptation. Every touch was an act of silent reclamation. The year 1355 saw the rise of a particularly influential circle in the heart of Paris, led by a countess who had used her vast inheritance to fund the construction of a private chapel within a sympathetic convent. This space was designed with hidden passages and double-thick walls to ensure that their conversations remained unheard by the outside world. Here, the women discussed the works of forbidden mystics and debated the nature of the soul, asserting that the highest form of spiritual experience was found in the harmonious union of the mind and the body. To maintain the secrecy of their network, they developed a complex system of symbolic communication that utilized the architectural and decorative elements of the abbey. A specific pattern of weaving on a tapestry or a particular arrangement of flowers on the altar could serve as a warning or an invitation to a meeting. They were turning the entire monastery into a living map of their organization, where every object held a secret meaning that was hidden in plain sight. This level of sophistication allowed them to coordinate activities across regions, ensuring that the movement grew despite the surveillance. The dual identity that these women maintained required a psychological fortitude that was as impressive as it was exhausting. During the day, they were the perfect examples of medieval piety, their heads bowed and their voices lowered in the presence of the male clergy. They performed their duties with a meticulous attention to detail that often earned them the praise of their superiors, further masking the reality of their nighttime activities. But when the moon rose over the stone battlements, they were transformed into the architects of their own liberation, shedding the mask of the submissive bride. In the year 1363, the movement reached a new level of maturity as the various clubs began to share resources and information on a broader scale. They established a courier system that utilized trusted servants and sympathetic merchants who were bound to them by ties of gratitude or financial reward. This allowed the women in a remote abbey in the mountains to communicate with their sisters in the bustling trade cities of the north, sharing the latest discoveries. The network was no longer a collection of groups but a cohesive force developing its own unique culture. The emotional bonds formed within these secret societies were the true strength of the movement, providing a level of support that was otherwise absent from the lives of medieval women. In a society that encouraged competition and suspicion among females, these clubs offered a radical alternative of mutual care and protection. They celebrated each other's triumphs and mourned their losses together, creating a sense of belonging that was more profound than any family tie. This solidarity was a powerful weapon against the isolation and the fear that the church used to maintain its control over the hearts. The music and poetry that emerged from these secret gatherings were reflections of their desire for a more fluid and expressive form of spiritual life. They composed hymns to the beauty of the earth and the complexity of human emotion, using polyphonic structures that were considered dangerously modern by the traditionalists. These songs were sung in low voices in the vaulted chambers of the abbey, their harmonies blending with the night air to create an atmosphere of haunting beauty. This artistic expression was a way of documenting their experiences and their beliefs, creating a legacy in the dark. As the 14th century moved into its final decades, the tension between the secret societies and the official church hierarchy began to mount, even if it remained largely unspoken. The authorities were not blind to the subtle changes in the demeanor of the women in their charge, nor to the unexplained influence that some of the abbeys seemed to possess. There were investigations into the financial records of the convents and more frequent inspections of the living quarters, as the bishops sought to reassert their control. The risk of discovery was higher than ever, yet the women continued on. By the year 1375, the movement had become a silent empire, a hidden world that operated with its own laws and its own vision of the future. The women who belonged to these clubs were no longer just seeking a temporary escape from their reality, they were building a new one, based on the principles of autonomy, pleasure, and mutual support. They had proven that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit cannot be entirely suppressed, and that the desire for connection and joy will always find a way to manifest itself in the cracks of the social order. Looking back at this era, we see a world of sharp contrasts, where the darkness of the plague and the coldness of the stone are balanced by the warmth of the secret candle and the softness of the hidden silk. The story of these women is a testament to the power of the underground, to the ability of the marginalized to find agency within the very systems that seek to erase them. Their meetings in the shadows were not just about pleasure, but about the preservation of the self in a world that demanded sacrifice. They were the architects of a secret revolution that would eventually be buried by time. As the bells for matins rang out across the frozen landscape, the women returned to their cells, their secrets safely tucked away beneath their simple bedding. They knew that the world outside remained unchanged, but within themselves, they carried a fire that no inquisitor could extinguish. The 14th century was drawing to a close, and with it, the first great chapter of their resistance. They had created something that would haunt the memory of the church for centuries, a legacy of defiance that proved that even behind the thickest of walls, the heart remains an unconquerable territory. The resonance of the word prayer in the cold corridors of the 14th century was usually a sign of total submission, a heavy weight carried by those who sought penance through silence. However, within the inner sanctum of the most prestigious convents, this ancient term began to undergo a radical and invisible transformation. It was no longer a plea for mercy from a distant and wrathful deity, but a sharp, precise instrument of entry. To utter the word in a specific cadence at the door of the abbess's residence was to signal that the mask of the ascetic could finally be dropped, revealing the vibrant and hungry soul beneath the wool. The heavy oak doors of the Mother Superior's private quarters, usually barred against the world, would swing open at the mention of this holy code, admitting a stream of women whose eyes sparkled with a secret fire. Once the latch was turned and the heavy iron bolt was slid into place, the stifling atmosphere of the chapel vanished, replaced by a warmth that felt almost illegal in its intensity. This was the heart of the labyrinth, a place where the rules of the Vatican had no reach and where the Gregorian chants were replaced by the low, melodic hum of intimate conversation and the rustle of forbidden silks. Inside these private chambers, the architectural austerity of the monastery was cleverly disguised with tapestries of forbidden origin, brought by merchant ships from the distant east. The scent of stale incense and unwashed wool was banished by the pervasive aroma of rose water and rare spices, creating a sensory bubble that isolated the inhabitants from the grim reality of the outside world. It was a space designed for the reclamation of the senses, where the cold stone was softened by cushions and the dim light of the tallow candles was augmented by the golden glow of refined beeswax, shimmering against the silver. The social hierarchy that defined the medieval world outside these walls began to dissolve as soon as the participants crossed the threshold of the secret chamber. A young novice, whose family had forced her into the veil to save a dowry, might find herself seated beside a duchess who had traveled through the night under the guise of a spiritual pilgrimage. In the dim light of the hidden room, the difference between a crown and a habit mattered far less than the shared desire for an autonomy that the patriarchal society denied them both. Here, the only currency that carried value was the courage to explore the depths. The gatherings were often timed to coincide with the most rigorous of the church's feast days or periods of fasting, adding a layer of ironic defiance to their secret celebrations. While the rest of the monastery was expected to exist on thin broth, dry bread, and silent contemplation, the table in the abbess's chamber would groan under the weight of delicacies. They enjoyed sugared fruits brought from the Mediterranean and spiced wines from the southern slopes of Burgundy. These items were technically forbidden, but here they were consumed with a sense of ritualistic joy, turning eating into a celebration of the world. Central to their philosophy was the belief that the body was not a vessel of sin to be punished, but a sacred instrument of revelation that had been misunderstood by male theologians. They argued that the ecstatic visions of the saints were not purely spiritual occurrences, but were deeply rooted in the physical sensations of the human frame. By exploring the heights of earthly pleasure, they believed they were actually mapping the terrain of the divine, finding God not in the negation of the self, but in its absolute fulfillment. This was the theology of touch, a doctrine that sought to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. To these women, the concept of the bride of Christ took on a much more literal and daring interpretation than the Church ever intended. They saw themselves as participants in a celestial romance that required a full engagement of both spirit and flesh, viewing their secret rituals as a form of higher worship that the uninitiated could never comprehend. This sense of being chosen, of possessing a secret knowledge that the bishops were too blind to see, gave them a formidable psychological shield. They were not merely breaking the rules, they were following a higher law that prioritized the expansion of the human soul. The language of their meetings was a complex tapestry of double meanings, where every theological term was infused with a secondary, sensual significance. A discussion on the nature of divine grace could easily be a thinly veiled instruction on the art of physical intimacy, while a debate on the Holy Trinity might serve as a framework for exploring the multifaceted nature of their own desires. This linguistic dexterity was a necessary survival skill, ensuring that if their journals were ever found, they would appear to be nothing more than the meditations of particularly zealous and perhaps slightly eccentric mystics. In the city of Cologne, during the year 1367, one such society reached a level of organization that allowed them to influence the very economy of the local parishes. They utilized the funds donated by wealthy patrons for charitable works to instead purchase rare manuscripts and exotic oils, creating a hidden library that rivaled the collections of the great universities. Their intellectual curiosity was as boundless as their pursuit of pleasure, as they sought to understand the mysteries of the natural world through the lens of their own unique experiences, untethered from dogmas. The risk of discovery was a constant shadow that hovered over their meetings, but instead of inducing fear, it seemed to heighten the intensity of their experiences. The knowledge that a single slip of the tongue or a betrayed confidence could lead to the dungeons of the Inquisition added a sharp edge to their joy. This adrenaline-fueled state of being was often described in their secret writings as a form of spiritual inebriation, a holy madness that allowed them to transcend the mundane worries of their daily lives. They lived on the precipice of disaster, finding a strange and powerful beauty in the danger. Mirrors, which were generally discouraged in monasteries as instruments of vanity, were used extensively in these secret gatherings to encourage a ritualistic form of self-contemplation. The women would study their own reflections, not to admire their physical beauty in a shallow sense, but to recognize the divine spark that they believed resided within their own eyes. This practice of self-love was a radical departure from the Church's emphasis on self-loathing and humility, fostering a sense of individual worth that was essential for their survival in a society that viewed them as property or vessels of sin. As the night deepened and the sounds of the monastery faded into a heavy silence, the rituals would reach their crescendo. The participants would engage in dances that were designed to induce a state of trance, their movements echoing the patterns they had seen in ancient, forbidden texts. These were not the chaotic dances of the peasantry, but calculated, graceful expressions of a philosophy that saw rhythm and harmony as the fundamental laws of the universe. In these moments, they felt themselves dissolving into a larger whole, achieving a sense of unity that the rigid structures of the Mass could not provide. By the time the first light of dawn began to touch the high windows of the abbey, the secret world would begin to dismantle itself with practiced efficiency. The tapestries were hidden, the silver was locked away, and the lingering scents of perfume were neutralized by the sharp, bitter smell of traditional floor wax. The women would return to their cells, their faces composed into the required expressions of somber piety, carrying within them the memory of a night that had changed their perception of reality. They were the keepers of a light that the world was not yet ready to see, a flame in the dark. The influence of these secret societies began to ripple outwards, affecting the way these women interacted with the male authorities in their lives. They displayed a subtle, quiet confidence that was often mistaken for a particularly deep form of religious devotion, allowing them to gain more autonomy within the administrative structures of the Church. They became masters of the soft power, using their perceived piety to secure greater freedoms for their sisters and to protect the interests of their hidden network. The bishops, unaware of the true source of this strength, often found themselves baffled. In the year 1372, a manuscript circulated through the underground networks of Paris that codified these beliefs into a formal system of thought. It argued that the soul's journey towards God was not a path of suffering and denial, but a staircase of ascending joys. This text, written by an anonymous author who signed herself only as the Daughter of the Sun, became a foundational document for these secret clubs, providing a common intellectual ground for their diverse memberships. It was a declaration of spiritual independence that placed the individual at the center. The gatherings in the abbess's chambers were also centers of political intrigue, where the women shared information about the movements of the royal courts and the shifting alliances of the nobility. They understood that their survival depended on their ability to navigate the complex web of medieval politics, and they used their connections to stay one step ahead of those who might seek to dismantle their organization. They were not just seekers of pleasure, they were astute observers of the world, utilizing their unique position within the church to gather intelligence that was unavailable to men. Despite the secrecy, rumors of these meetings began to circulate among the lower orders of the clergy and the common people, often taking the form of twisted tales of witchcraft and diabolical pacts. These stories were a reflection of the deep-seated fear that the male establishment felt towards any form of female power that they could not explain or control. The women of the secret clubs heard these rumors and laughed, knowing that the reality of their gatherings was far more sophisticated and far more dangerous to the church's authority than the crude fantasies of the superstitious populace. The aesthetic of their meetings was a deliberate challenge to the visual poverty of the medieval era. They surrounded themselves with beauty in all its forms, from the intricate carvings on their wine cups to the melodic complexity of their secret hymns. This commitment to beauty was a political act, an assertion that even in a world of plague and war, the human spirit had a right to seek out and create grace. They were the curators of a hidden renaissance, a flourishing of art and thought that existed long before the official rebirth of culture would take place in the centuries that were to follow. As the 14th century neared its end, the philosophy of these secret societies had become so ingrained in the minds of its members that it began to alter their very physical presence. They walked with a grace and an assurance that stood in stark contrast to the hunched, fearful posture of the common penitent. This transformation was a source of great anxiety for the more traditional monks, who sensed a power in these women that they could not name. It was the power of a human being who had discovered that the chains of the world were made of nothing more than the illusions of their captors. The legacy of these clubs remains buried in the margins of history, hidden in the coded language of ancient manuscripts and the silent stones of ruined abbeys. Yet, the echo of their laughter and the intensity of their conviction still vibrate through the centuries, reminding us that the human desire for freedom can never be truly extinguished. They proved that even in the heart of a system designed to suppress them, women could create a world of their own, where prayer was a key, the body was a temple, and the pursuit of joy was the most sacred duty of all, regardless of the consequences. Deep within the archives of the Vatican, there are reports from the year 1384 that speak of a sudden and unexplained increase in the number of female mystics claiming direct revelation. These reports, written in the frantic hand of confused inquisitors, show that the authorities were beginning to lose their grip on the narrative of spiritual authority. The women of the secret societies had successfully bypassed the gatekeepers of heaven, creating a direct line to the divine that required no male intervention, a development that struck terror into the heart of the church. The physical artifacts of these meetings, though mostly destroyed or hidden, occasionally surface in the most unlikely of places, providing a tantalizing glimpse into a lost world. A silver goblet found in a French vineyard, engraved with verses that celebrate the union of soul and flesh, or a scrap of silk found in a Flemish chimney, are the silent witnesses to a movement that refused to be erased. These objects carry the energy of 1,000 secret nights, of whispered conversations that challenged the foundations of the world and celebrated the enduring power of the female spirit in a time of darkness. The transition from the public face of the monastery to the private reality of the secret club was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. It required a level of discipline and focus that would be impressive in any age, but was truly extraordinary in an era of such limited personal freedom. Every gesture, every word, and every glance was part of a carefully constructed facade that protected a core of absolute, uncompromising liberty. These women were the first true moderns, living lives of profound complexity and intellectual daring while the world around them remained mired in the shadows of the past. In the final years of the century, as the political landscape of Europe shifted and the church faced internal schisms, the secret societies found even more opportunities to expand their influence. They became the quiet architects of a new way of being, one that emphasized the importance of the individual experience and the sanctity of personal desire. Their story is a reminder that the official version of history is often just a thin veil covering a much richer and more complicated reality, where the most important battles are fought in the quiet spaces of the heart and the secret chambers of the mind. As the candle burns low in the abbess's chamber, the women prepare to face another day of public humility and private strength. They know that their secret is safe for now, protected by the very walls that were built to contain them. They are the guardians of a tradition that celebrates life in all its messy, beautiful complexity, and they will continue to gather, to pray in their own code, and to find heaven on earth as long as the stone remains and the night provides its shelter. Their journey is far from over, and their legacy is a flame that will never truly be put out by the hands of men. The map of Europe during the late 14th century was increasingly defined by an invisible architecture of secrets that ran parallel to the established trade routes and pilgrimage paths of the age. From the bustling merchant houses of Bruges to the aristocratic salons of Milan, a silent web of communication had been woven, connecting women who shared a common desire for intellectual and physical sovereignty. This network functioned like a shadow kingdom, operating with its own distinct protocols and using the very institutions of the Church as its primary means of expansion and survival, turning the sacred landscape into a field of clandestine operations. The bridge between the secular world of the high nobility and the secluded life of the cloister was built upon the shared grievances of women whose lives were treated as commodities. The wives of influential counts and the daughters of wealthy merchant princes found in the monastery a unique form of sanctuary where the prying eyes of their husbands and fathers could not reach. This alliance between the castle and the convent created a powerful synergy, combining the financial resources and political influence of the secular elite with the intellectual freedom and physical privacy afforded by the monastic walls. To justify their long absences from the domestic sphere, these noblewomen utilized the concept of the sacred journey, claiming a sudden and profound need for pilgrimage or a period of intense spiritual retreat. Under the guise of seeking divine guidance or performing penance for their sins, they would travel with a small, trusted retinue to distant abbeys, disappearing behind the heavy iron gates for weeks at a time. These journeys were perfectly acceptable within the social fabric of the 1400s, providing the ideal cover for meetings that were focused on the celebration of life. Within the protected confines of the abbey, the rigid social distinctions of the medieval world were momentarily suspended in favor of a radical equality of the spirit and the body. The countess would discard her heavy robes of state, and the nun would set aside her traditional habit, both adopting a simple, elegant attire that signaled their membership in the secret society. They spent their days in deep conversation and their nights in rituals that were increasingly bold, transforming the quiet gardens and vaulted stone chambers into spaces where the ancient and the modern merged in a dance of joy. As the years progressed, the nature of these gatherings began to shift from simple sensory indulgence to a more profound and dangerous form of philosophical radicalism. The members were no longer content with merely escaping their daily lives, they sought to understand the very nature of their existence through a lens that was entirely independent of the official church. They began to integrate elements of ancient nature worship and half-forgotten pagan rhythms into their practices, believing that the cycles of the moon and the changing of the seasons held more truth than the dry dogmas of the bishops. The rituals grew more elaborate, often incorporating music and poetry that celebrated the divinity of the natural world and the sacredness of human desire. They would gather in the forest clearings owned by the monasteries during the summer solstice, performing dances that were intended to align their personal energies with the pulse of the earth. These acts were not seen by the participants as a rejection of God, but as a deeper form of communion with the Creator who was found in the beauty of a blooming flower or the warmth of a shared embrace, rather than in the cold, dark cathedrals. Philosophical debates became a central feature of these clandestine retreats, as the women began to question the very foundations of the Holy Trinity and the necessity of priestly intercession. Influenced by the forbidden works of Neoplatonists and the suppressed voices of early Christian mystics, they argued that the soul was an autonomous entity that required no external authority to reach a state of grace. This intellectual freedom was the most dangerous weapon in their arsenal, as it struck at the heart of the Church's control over the spiritual life of the European population. They began to identify themselves as the Sisters of the Free Spirit, a term that had already begun to circulate among the various heretical movements of the age. However, unlike the more public and often impoverished heretics, these women operated with a level of sophistication and secrecy that made them almost impossible to detect. They understood that their power lay in their ability to remain invisible, using the language of the liturgy to mask their radical ideas and their wealth to ensure the loyalty of those who might be tempted to speak of their activities to the authorities. Despite their best efforts to maintain absolute secrecy, rumors of the strange occurrences within certain abbeys began to drift like acrid smoke through the crowded marketplaces and narrow streets of the cities. Gossip among the lower orders of servants and the grooms who tended the horses of the noblewomen started to paint a picture of nighttime revelries and mysterious rites that did not resemble any known form of devotion. These whispers were often dismissed as the idle talk of the superstitious, but they planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the local parish priests and friars. The leak of information was often accidental, a result of the sheer scale of the network and the number of people required to facilitate the long journeys and the delivery of luxury goods. A merchant might notice that an unusual amount of fine silk and exotic spices was being sent to a convent known for its supposed austerity, or a servant might catch a glimpse of a forbidden book hidden within a lady's luggage. These small fragments of evidence began to accumulate, creating a mosaic of suspicion that was slowly brought to the attention of the higher levels of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. By the year 1386, the atmosphere within the major cathedrals of Europe had begun to change, as the clergy became more vigilant in their observation of the female members of their flocks. There was a noticeable shift in the way women were treated during confession, with priests asking more probing questions about their private thoughts and their associations outside the home. This increased surveillance was a direct response to the growing sense that something was amiss, a silent realization that the spiritual monopoly of the Church was being challenged from within. The emergence of the inquisitorial shadow was the inevitable result of these mounting suspicions, as the papacy sought to reassert its authority over a world that seemed to be slipping towards chaos. The Dominican friars, often referred to as the Hounds of God, were tasked with the identification and eradication of any belief system that threatened the unity of the faith. They began to compile ledgers of names and locations, tracking the movements of noblewomen and the reputations of specific abbeys with a meticulous attention to detail that signaled the beginning of a systematic purge. The inquisitors were particularly interested in the concept of the eternal God, which they saw as the ultimate form of spiritual pride and the root of all heresy. They understood that if an individual believed they could find salvation within themselves, the entire structure of the Church, from the village priest to the Pope himself, would become obsolete. This was not merely a matter of theology, it was a matter of political and social survival for the men who had spent centuries building a world where they were the sole arbiters of truth and the only gatekeepers of the afterlife. In the year 1390, a formal investigation was launched into several prominent convents in the Rhineland, sparked by the testimony of a disgruntled former servant who claimed to have witnessed a pagan ritual in the abbey gardens. The investigators moved with a cold, calculated precision, arriving unannounced and demanding access to the private records and quarters of the sisters. This was the first major breach of the sanctuary that the secret societies had relied upon, and it sent a wave of panic through the network, forcing many to burn their manuscripts and hide their artifacts. The tension between the secret world of the women and the public world of the inquisitors reached a boiling point as the two forces began to collide in the courtrooms and the torture chambers of the Inquisition. The women found themselves caught in a struggle for which they were only partially prepared, as their sophisticated arguments and philosophical justifications were met with the blunt force of canonical law and physical pain. They were no longer just participants in a secret club, they were combatants in a war for the future of the human spirit, facing an enemy that showed no mercy. Even as the arrests began, the network attempted to adapt, moving their meetings to even more remote locations and developing new codes that were even more difficult to decipher. The solidarity that had been forged in the secret chambers of the abbeys now became a matter of life and death, as the inquisitors sought to turn the women against each other through the use of fear and psychological manipulation. Every woman who was taken into custody became a potential source of information that could unravel the entire organization, putting the lives of hundreds of sisters and noblewomen at risk. The visual evidence of this struggle could be seen in the changing landscape of the medieval city, where the once bustling pilgrimage routes became sites of intense scrutiny and suspicion. The colorful tents and banners of the noble retinues were replaced by the somber black and white robes of the Dominican investigators, who stood at the gates of the towns like sentinels of the old order. The sense of joy and discovery that had defined the secret societies was being systematically replaced by a climate of dread, as the world of the 14th century prepared for a final, violent confrontation. The records of the heresy that were produced during this time provide a distorted but fascinating glimpse into the scale of the movement and the radical nature of its beliefs. The inquisitors wrote of women who claimed to be equal to the angels and who believed that their own desires were the commands of God himself. While these accounts were intended to shock and condemn, they also accidentally preserved the voices of those who had dared to dream of a world where the soul was free and the body was a source of light rather than a burden of sin. As the 14th century drew to a close, the secret societies were forced further into the shadows, their once vibrant network now a series of isolated pockets of resistance. The dream of a shared sanctuary of pleasure and intellect was being crushed by the weight of an institution that valued order over life and dogma over experience. Yet, even in the face of this overwhelming pressure, the spirit of the clubs remained alive in the hearts of those who had experienced the freedom of the secret night, a memory of a time when the world was wide and the heart was its own law. The final days of the century were marked by a sense of impending storm, as the Inquisition prepared to move against the highest levels of the network. They had identified the influential sponsors who had funded the societies and the visionary leaders who had shaped their philosophy, and they were ready to strike a blow that would erase the movement from history forever. The tragedy of this moment lies in the realization that the very success and sophistication of the clubs had made them the primary targets of an institution that could not tolerate the existence of a world it did not own. The winter of 1391 brought a frost that seemed to penetrate the very soul of the Rhineland, but it was nothing compared to the chill that descended upon the great abbey when the black-robed investigators finally arrived. Led by Brother Conrad, a man whose heart was as hard as the iron cross he wore, the group bypassed the traditional greetings and moved directly to the heart of the cloisters. They did not come to pray, they came to dissect a world they had long suspected was rotting from within. Their presence was a violent intrusion into a sanctuary that had stood for centuries as a bastion of silence and prayer, now suddenly exposed to the harsh light of judgment. The inquisitors moved through the stone corridors with the precision of soldiers, their heavy boots echoing against the vaulted ceilings in a rhythm that signaled the end of an era. They did not bother with the pleasantries of the Mother Superior, instead demanding the keys to every cell and every storage room within the vast complex. There was a sense of grim inevitability in their movements, as if they had already seen the evidence they were about to uncover. The sisters stood in the shadows, their faces pale and their hands trembling, watching as the authority they had navigated so carefully for decades was systematically dismantled by the representatives of the Holy See. In the small, cramped cells that were supposed to house only a pallet and a crucifix, the searchers unearthed the physical reality of a hidden life that defied every ecclesiastical law. They tore open straw mattresses and pried loose the stones of the hearths, discovering caches of items that spoke of a deep and unrepentant luxury. Bottles of distilled jasmine, jars of honeyed ointments from the Far East, and intricate combs carved from whalebone were tossed onto the cold floors like pieces of garbage. These were not the tools of witchcraft, but the instruments of a sensory refinement that the Church had spent centuries trying to extinguish from the female experience. The most damning evidence was found within the private study of the abbess herself, where a hidden compartment behind a portrait of Saint Jerome revealed a collection of scrolls and books. These were not the approved lives of the saints, but the works of forbidden poets and radical philosophers who spoke of the sovereignty of the individual soul. The inquisitors found treatises on the nature of joy and manuals of physical intimacy that were written with a clinical and appreciative eye. The sight of these documents, carefully maintained and annotated by female hands, sent a shock through the investigators that was far more profound than any discovery of simple physical sin. As the sun began to set behind the jagged mountains, the searchers discovered the ledger that would turn a local investigation into a continental scandal. It was a thick book bound in green leather, containing a meticulously kept list of names that spanned the entire social spectrum of the region. Here were the names of the daughters of powerful barons, the wives of influential merchant princes, and even the sisters of those who sat on the high councils of the Church. The scale of the conspiracy was suddenly laid bare, revealing a network of shared secrets and mutual support that reached into the very heart of the patriarchal establishment that the Inquisition was sworn to protect. The realization that their own families were involved caused a moment of paralyzed silence among the investigators, as they looked at the names of women they had known since childhood. These were the same women who appeared at the front of every procession, who donated vast sums to the building of cathedrals, and who were held up as models of Catholic virtue. To find them recorded as members of a secret club dedicated to pleasure and autonomy was a blow to the very foundations of their world. It suggested that the piety they saw in the public square was nothing more than a carefully constructed mask, hiding a reality that they could neither understand nor control. The interrogation of the high-ranking sisters began in the dead of night, held in the freezing cold of the abbey's chapter house. The inquisitors expected to find broken women, weeping for mercy and begging for a chance to do penance for their perceived crimes. Instead, they were met with an icy, unwavering confidence that left them speechless. The abbess, a woman of 60 with eyes that burned like cold embers, refused to look down or show any sign of shame. She spoke of her life and the lives of her sisters with a terrifying clarity, asserting that they had found a path to the divine that required no permission from the men who sought to judge them. During these long hours of questioning, the defendants did not deny their actions or the existence of their secret gatherings. They argued with a sophisticated logic that their clubs were the only places in a cruel and restrictive world where they could truly be alive. They claimed that the Church's obsession with suffering and denial was a distortion of the Creator's intent, and that the experience of pleasure was a sacred right that they had reclaimed for themselves. This was not the desperate defense of a sinner, but the intellectual manifesto of a new type of human being, one who saw freedom as a higher virtue than obedience to a distant and uncaring hierarchy. The term heresy of autonomy began to appear in the secret reports sent back to Rome, as the inquisitors struggled to categorize what they were witnessing. They realized that they were not dealing with a simple cult or a momentary lapse in discipline, but with an organized resistance to the very concept of spiritual monopoly. The women were not trying to replace the church with another religion, they were creating a private space where the church simply did not matter. This was a direct threat to the social order of the 1400s, as it suggested that the most fundamental unit of control, the conscience of the individual, was no longer within their grasp. The psychological impact on the younger inquisitors was particularly devastating, as they found themselves drawn to the strength and the conviction of the women they were supposed to condemn. They listened to descriptions of a world where friendship and joy were the primary goals, and where the body was celebrated as a temple of light. For men who had been raised in an atmosphere of fear and self-loathing, these ideas were like a poison that tasted like wine. The leaders of the investigation had to rotate their staff frequently, fearing that the very heresy they were trying to eradicate was beginning to infect the minds of those tasked with its destruction. As the days turned into weeks, the interrogation rooms became theaters of a profound ideological war. The inquisitors used every tool at their disposal, from the threat of the stake to the psychological pressure of isolation, but the core of the group remained unbroken. They spoke of their secret nights not as scenes of debauchery, but as moments of profound spiritual clarity where they felt the presence of the divine more clearly than they ever did during the Mass. This refusal to accept the label of sin was the most radical act of all, as it stripped the Inquisition of its most powerful weapon, the ability to induce guilt. The lists of names continued to haunt the proceedings, acting as a silent barrier to any public trial. The authorities knew that if they brought these women to the market square to be burned, they would spark a civil war that would tear the kingdoms apart. The husbands and fathers of the accused, many of whom were the financial backers of the Inquisition itself, began to send private messengers to the abbey, demanding a quiet resolution to the matter. This pressure from the secular elite created a stalemate, forcing the church to choose between its desire for a total purge and its need to maintain the support of the ruling classes. By the middle of February, the decision was made to keep the entire investigation a secret of the highest order. The evidence was gathered into heavy iron chests, and the scrolls were transported under armed guard to the secret archives of the Vatican. The inquisitors were ordered to stop the formal interrogations and instead prepare for a series of private censures and silent disappearances. The Church could not afford to admit that such a widespread and sophisticated movement had existed under its nose for so long, nor could it risk the public realization that its control over the female soul was so fundamentally fragile and incomplete. The final reports written by Brother Conrad reflect a sense of profound defeat, despite his successful suppression of the group. He wrote of a darkness that he could not illuminate and a wall that he could not break, acknowledging that while they could destroy the books and imprison the bodies, they could not touch the memory of the freedom these women had experienced. He recognized that this was a heresy of the future, a precursor to a world where the individual would no longer seek the light from an external source but would find it within themselves. It was a realization that made him feel old and obsolete in a changing world. The atmosphere in the abbey changed from one of vibrant secrecy to one of heavy, oppressive silence. The gardens where they had once danced were now off limits, and the library was purged of every volume that did not carry the seal of the holy censors. The women were moved to separate wings of the building, forbidden from speaking to one another or even making eye contact during the daily offices. But even in this enforced isolation, the light in their eyes remained, a silent signal that the connection they had forged was still alive beneath the surface of their mandatory penance, waiting for a chance to rise again. This moment of truth revealed the ultimate weakness of the medieval order, its inability to coexist with anything it did not define. The clash with the Inquisition was not just a legal proceeding, but a collision between two different visions of what it meant to be human. On one side was the world of the stone and the law, and on the other was the world of the silk and the spirit. The tragedy of the year 1391 was that the law had the power to silence the spirit, but it did not have the power to convince it of its own wrongness, leaving a wound in the heart of the age. The artifacts found during the searches, the perfume, the silk, the forbidden words, were mostly burned in a great bonfire in the inner courtyard, a fire that lasted for 3 days and nights. The smoke carried the scent of jasmine and ancient parchment over the walls of the abbey and into the surrounding villages, a sensory ghost that reminded everyone of what had been lost. Those who smelled it knew that something extraordinary had ended, even if they did not have the words to describe it. It was the scent of a rebellion that had been consumed by the flames, leaving only ashes and the cold, unyielding stone. As the investigators finally left the abbey, riding their horses through the slush of the late winter snow, they did not carry the air of victors. They looked like men who had seen a ghost and knew they would be haunted by it for the rest of their lives. They had looked into the eyes of women who were truly free, and in doing so, they had realized the extent of their own chains. The Inquisition had won the battle of the cells, but it had lost the war for the future, as it had proven that its only answer to the pursuit of happiness was the application of darkness and the enforcement of the void. The ledger of names was the last item to be packed into the iron chests, its green leather cover scratched and worn from the many hands that had searched its pages for a sign of hope or a reason for condemnation. It was the map of a lost world, a list of those who had dared to step out of the shadows and into the light of their own making. As the lid of the chest was closed and the padlock was snapped shut, the names disappeared from the memory of the world, consigned to a silence that would last for 600 years, until the dust was finally disturbed once more. The final irony of the investigation was that by suppressing the evidence, the Church ensured that the movement would never be properly understood or learned from. By choosing silence over a public reckoning, they allowed the seeds of the heresy of pleasure to lie dormant in the collective subconscious, waiting for a more receptive age to bloom. The women in their cells, now reduced to shadows of their former selves, understood this better than their captors. They knew that while they were defeated in the present, the truth of their experience was an indelible mark on the fabric of time that no amount of ink or fire could ever truly erase. The final verdict was not delivered in a crowded square, but in the suffocating stillness of a sealed chamber. In the year 1393, the highest authorities of the Holy See gathered to decide the fate of the secret societies. They realized that the standard spectacle of the stake would be a catastrophic mistake, for it would give a face to the rebellion. To kill these women publicly would be to admit their power. Instead, the council chose a punishment far more terrifying than the flame. They decided to simply unmake them, to peel their existences away from the fabric of time. The systematic erasure began with the physical evidence that had been so meticulously gathered. In the courtyards of the episcopal palaces, fires were lit that burned not with the smell of wood, but with the chemical reek of melting wax seals and ancient vellum. Thousands of pages of testimony, lists of names, and descriptions of rituals were fed into the heat until only white ash remained. Every mention of the secret clubs was struck from the official records of the Inquisition, leaving blank spaces in the ledgers where the truth of a massive female movement had once been recorded with terrifying detail. The women themselves were handled with a clinical, quiet brutality that left no room for martyrdom. Those of the highest birth were returned to their ancestral estates under the cover of night, where they were confined to remote towers or subterranean apartments. Their families, desperate to avoid the taint of heresy, collaborated with the Church to ensure these daughters and wives were never seen or heard from again. To the outside world, it was whispered that they had succumbed to a sudden, wasting illness or had been struck by a divine madness that required absolute and eternal seclusion from society. For the nuns who had led the societies within the abbeys, the fate was even more isolated and grim. They were stripped of their ranks and dispersed to the most desolate convents in the mountains of the south or the frozen marshes of the east. These were places where the rule of Saint Benedict was enforced with a literal and soul-crushing intensity. They were forbidden from speaking any word other than the prescribed prayers and were denied access to any form of writing material. Their lives became a loop of silent labor and forced contemplation, designed to break the memory of the joy they had found. In these remote prisons, the very names of the participants were systematically replaced by generic identifiers. A woman who had been a visionary leader, an architect of secret networks, was now referred to only as Sister Penitence or Subject Number 12. This was the second death, the death of identity, which ensured that even if a traveler visited these places, they would find only shadows of women, not individuals with histories. The church archives were purged of their baptismal records and their family lineages, effectively erasing their entry into the human story as if they had never been born at all. The code that had once turned the word prayer into a key for liberty was reclaimed by the patriarchal order and used as a weapon of suppression. Every time the women were forced to chant the liturgy, they were reminded of the language they had lost. The inquisitors remained in the convents for years, acting as silent shadows in the choir, watching for any sign of a secret gesture or a knowing glance. The atmosphere of the monasteries became one of perpetual surveillance, where the fear of a single slip of the tongue was enough to keep the survivors in a state of constant, paralyzing anxiety. The husbands and fathers who had been part of the cover-up were bound by a pact of silence that was enforced by the threat of total financial ruin and excommunication. They were forced to watch as the memory of their wives and daughters faded, unable to speak their names even in private. This collective amnesia was the price they paid to maintain their social standing and their proximity to power. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that those who had loved these women became the primary agents of their erasure, burying the truth of their spirits beneath the requirements of family honor and political safety. As the decades of the late 14th century turned into the 15th, the physical spaces where the societies had flourished were transformed to remove any trace of their existence. Hidden passages were filled with heavy rubble and sealed with fresh mortar that was aged to match the surrounding stone. Secret chambers were converted into mundane storage rooms for grain or wine, their walls painted over with scenes of grim martyrdom and suffering. The architecture of the monastery was forced back into its original, oppressive form, leaving no physical clue that a revolution of the heart had ever taken place. The intellectual legacy of the movement, the dangerous idea that the soul could find God through the medium of pleasure, was buried so deep that it would not resurface for centuries. The Church launched a renewed campaign of teaching that emphasized the inherent sinfulness of the female form, using the distorted rumors of the secret clubs as a basis for new, more restrictive laws. By turning the reality of a sophisticated intellectual and sensual movement into a vague, dark myth of diabolical influence, they successfully poisoned the well of history for all future generations of women. The most insulting part of this process was the creation of the moralizing legends that replaced the true story. The few whispers that escaped the walls were twisted into stories of female vanity and the dangers of allowing women too much education or leisure. These fictionalized accounts portrayed the members of the clubs as weak-willed victims of their own passions or as pawns of unseen demonic forces, stripping them of their agency and their intelligence. The vibrant, courageous reality of their rebellion was rewritten into a dull and repetitive sermon on the necessity of female submission. We must confront the horrifying realization that much of what we call history is simply the record of what the victors allowed to remain. When we look at the ruins of the medieval world, we see a story of masculine power and monolithic faith because the alternatives were systematically annihilated. The silence that surrounds the secret societies of the 1400s is not a natural void, but a manufactured one. It is a scar on the memory of humanity, representing the millions of voices that were silenced not by death, but by the deliberate destruction of their very names and deeds. The emotional weight of this erasure is felt in the hollow spaces of the old abbeys, where the air still seems to hum with the energy of something that was never allowed to finish. There is a sense of profound indignation in knowing that these women were closer to a modern understanding of autonomy and self-worth than any of their contemporaries. They were the first to suggest that happiness was not a sin and that the body was a source of light, yet they were punished with a void so absolute that even their descendants have forgotten they ever existed. It is a theft of heritage that remains uncorrected. The inquisitors who oversaw the final dissolution of the groups often died in isolation themselves, haunted by what they had seen and what they had done. In the private journals of Brother Conrad, which managed to survive in a different, forgotten collection, he wrote of his fear that the silence he had enforced would one day speak louder than the prayers he had defended. He recognized that by erasing these women, he had created a ghost that would haunt the Church forever. He understood that the truth has a weight that cannot be permanently lifted, even by the most powerful institutions of men. Looking at the heavy, unyielding walls of the great convents today, one cannot help but feel a sense of cold fury at the efficiency of the suppression. We are standing on the graves of a revolution that never happened, a future that was strangled in its sleep. The stones do not speak of the silk ribbons, the rare perfumes, or the radical debates that once filled these halls. They only speak of the silence that followed. This is the ultimate victory of the patriarchs. They didn't just win the battle, they removed the memory of the conflict, leaving us with a world that feels as if it was always this way. The small ivory chest mentioned at the beginning of this account is one of the few accidents of history that allows us to peer through the shroud. It survived only because a sympathetic novice, whose name we will never know, managed to hide it in the deepest part of the crypt before the searchers reached her wing. It is a miraculous survivor of a systematic purge, a tiny spark of light that managed to endure the darkness of 6 centuries. It serves as a silent witness to the complexity and the daring of a generation of women who were far more than the shadows history has made them out to be. As we close this dark chapter, the primary emotion that remains is not one of peace, but of a deep, unsettled anger. We are forced to acknowledge that we are the beneficiaries of a censored past, and that the freedom we enjoy today was bought at the price of the total erasure of those who first dared to imagine it. The story of the secret clubs is a reminder that the struggle for the right to happiness is as old as the human spirit itself, and that the most dangerous weapon against tyranny is not the sword, but the refusal to forget that we were once capable of being whole and free. The final image of this history is not a dramatic execution, but a single, candlelit cell where a woman, once a leader of hundreds, sits in absolute silence. She stares at the stone wall, her mind still filled with the music and the laughter of the secret nights, but her lips are sealed by a vow she cannot break. She is a living ghost in a world that has already forgotten her. In her silence, there is a power that the Inquisition could never take away, but it is a power that died with her, leaving only the cold wind to howl through the cloisters and the indifferent dust to settle. The tragedy of the 1400s is not just that these women were punished, but that their attempt to reclaim their humanity was treated as a crime against the universe itself. The church and the nobility cooperated to ensure that no future woman would ever look to these examples for inspiration. They wanted a world where the female experience was a flat, gray landscape of obedience, and they were willing to burn the very records of their own history to achieve it. This is the legacy of the silence, a world that was robbed of its own potential for grace and intellectual diversity. We must learn to listen to the silence of the archives and to see the gaps in the stone. The story of the secret societies is a call to look beneath the surface of the official narrative and to find the voices that were never meant to be heard. Only by acknowledging the scale of the erasure can we begin to honor the memory of the women who lived and loved in the shadows. They were the pioneers of a secret light, and though their names are lost, the echo of their defiance remains, a haunting reminder that the human heart can never be fully conquered, even by the most absolute of silences. In the end, the history of the 14th century women's clubs is a testament to the fragility of our collective memory. It shows us how easily the truth can be buried and how much effort is required to keep it hidden. The walls of the monasteries remain, beautiful and terrifying in their permanence, but we now know what they were designed to conceal. Underneath the faith and the stone lies the memory of a first, desperate attempt to find heaven on earth, a dream that was crushed by a world of men who were too afraid of the light to let it shine in the eyes of their own mothers.